Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this workshop on reopening schools in a time of COVID-19. Joining us today, we have five wonderful speakers. They are Tommy Schultz, Vice President of Communications and Marketing at American Federation for Children, Scott Jensen, Senior Government Affairs Advisor at American Federation for Children, DENISHA MERRIWEATHER, Director of Family Engagement at American Federation for Children, NYDIA SALAZAR CALDERON, Voices for Choice at American Federation for Children, and ERIKA, President and CEO of the Optima Foundation. In this session, these policy experts will be examining how to safely reopen schools, how federal relief can both expand options for families and empower states to be innovative, and how we can prevent permanent closure of private schools serving children from lower-income families. Before we kick off the session, I'd like to walk through a few quick housekeeping tips before the panel begins. If you'd like to ask any of the panelists questions during their presentation, you'll be able to submit questions via the chat box. You can find that at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to all questions at the end of their presentation. The chat box will also be used for handouts and policy resources from the American Federation for Children. If you're interested in rewatching this workshop, please note that we'll be distributing this panel through Connect later on, and we'll be releasing it on our YouTube channel. We can also send you the video when it's released. Now, to kick off the panel, we'll be having Tommy Schultz from the American Federation for Children give some opening remarks.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Appreciate James and Alec for hosting us here. We're excited to have a lively discussion about a topic that's at the forefront of many parents' minds right now. Approximately 50 million or so parents have been essentially restricted to a quarantined homeschool environment since March or April all over the country, rather unprecedented in the history of our K-12 school system. And to set the table, I'd like to ask Scott a bit about what parents are feeling right now. You've been studying polls and working in a lot of different states as we've had this ongoing discussion about what does the future of K-12 schooling look like, either post-pandemic, in the midst of the pandemic. So why don't you tell us some of what you've been seeing and what some of your thoughts are to open things up?
Well, I think we're seeing a couple of things, Tommy, in the polling around the country. The first thing we're seeing is that parents were very forgiving in the spring about the quality of their children's education when schools were suddenly shut down, and the schools with no notice suddenly had to scramble and try to figure out how to keep education going. I think parents were very forgiving. They knew it was unprecedented and unexpected, but they're expecting more in the fall. When parents are asked if the schools did a good job in the spring, they say yes. And they asked if you got the same education in the fall, would you be happy? Oh, absolutely not. So again, they were forgiving about the quality of that education when people were scrambling, but they feel schools have had several months now to get their act together, and they're expecting a much better education in the fall. The other thing we're seeing is that while the general public feels that it's still a little unsafe to open up schools for in-person instruction, that's exactly what parents want. Polling in Texas shows that 65% of the public thinks that it's probably not quite yet safe to open up the schools there. And yet if you ask parents, 63% of them are counting on the fact they want their schools to be open so their children can have in-person instruction. And the fact that schools are quite frequently around the country announcing that they're not going to open in person on the first day of the semester. We're anecdotally seeing lots of upper middle class families giving calls to private schools to see, is there a way I can get my kid in, and parents asking about other options that they have available. Parents taking a look at maybe even creating their own micro school instead of them just one parent trying to teach all the kids in their house. Maybe we get several families together in a micro school and we take turns teaching different things to kids, and the kids can learn together in some way. So the parents are clearly looking for new options this fall. Unfortunately, we're seeing the teachers union head in the other direction. They're trying to shut down options. The teachers union in many cases is saying that we shouldn't be opening up the schools for in-person instruction. And they're also out there trying to say that means the private schools and the charter schools shouldn't open up for in-person instruction. So they're trying to cut off options for parents at a time when parents are demanding more options.
Right. I mean, so here at the American Federation for Children, we're working across the country to expand educational options for families at the K-12 level. And while some people might assert that, well, the work that we do isn't really applicable at the moment because we're dealing with the issues of the pandemic, but I have to say, gosh, if that's not the case, it certainly rhymes. As you said, the unions are trying to take away options from families as these schools are looking to reopen. Are you seeing in the states that you're working in across the country some similarities in how governors are approaching this, how legislatures are even thinking about this going into the next legislative session, and maybe what are some lessons that you might have and some good data points that you can point to across the country?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One, I think most states concluded they were not ready to flip from in-person instruction over to virtual instruction. And the states have spent hundreds of millions of dollars that the federal government gave them to suddenly try to make sure that every kid has a computer and a connection, and that teachers belatedly are getting trained in how to do online instruction, because it's different in engaging students online than it is in the classroom. Way too many schools this spring were just sending out worksheets by email, and that counted as their online instruction. And that's not what virtual instruction should really be about. That's pretty common across the country, what people have been doing. But there's some governors who took their money and did some very innovative things. And some of it's just been very recent in the last week. You know, last Friday, we saw Governor Stitt of Oklahoma announced that he was going to be doing a couple of innovative things with the discretionary funds that the federal government gave governors. First, he's going to be putting $10 million into private school scholarships. His logic is that we want all kids to be able to stay connected to the school that they were attending. But unfortunately, parents have lost their jobs. Schools, private schools are always tight on their budgets and difficult. He wants to make sure those kids stay in school, not only because it's better for their education, but if those schools close because parents can't afford to send their kids to those private schools anymore, those kids will be coming to the public schools, and that will increase public costs. So he's putting $10 million into private school scholarships of up to $6,500 per kid. He's also giving out little micro grants to families. He's clearly in the mood of trusting parents in Oklahoma. He's going to give out to families who don't have a good connection to their public school or their private school grants of up to $1,500, so families can go out and buy a computer, get a good internet connection, get the curriculum that perhaps their kids missed in the spring. And he's, rather than sending it to the public schools, he's giving it to the parents and letting them make that decision. Well, that was Friday. Then on Monday, the governor of South Carolina, Governor McMaster, announced that he was going to be putting $32 million into private school scholarships. Again, wanting to make sure those schools stay open and those kids stay connected with them. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been flowing to public schools, but private schools, those kids were affected by the pandemic as well, and they deserve support. There's another state that I can't announce yet, but another state's going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks with a program for special education students. You know, they may have been the ones most affected in this pandemic. It's really important for special education students to get those special education services, the one-on-one time with instructors and with therapists. And that got cut off when we shut the schools down in the spring, and it didn't return. And so in this state, the governor's taking a look at giving out summer catch-up grants to families of children with special needs. So those families can go out and buy the tutoring and the therapies and the special education services their children have been denied for several months. It's really important with special education students for them to constantly be getting those things reinforced, and they've gone 5 months without it. But there's really no state that's done more, I think, and been more innovative and more parent-oriented, more student-oriented than the state of Florida. They're clearly the best of class. And I think ERIKA is the one who's going to tell us a little bit about what Florida's been up to.
Sure. I mean, that's a good transition point. I mean, Florida has always been forward thinking for the past 20 or so years. When it comes to K through 12 education, we're actually going to hear from a beneficiary of one of those reforms in a bit, DENISHA MERRIWEATHER. But yeah, let's turn it over to ERIKA. ERIKA, you have been involved in the school choice movement for quite a bit of time. Your husband is a state legislator. You yourself are still active day to day in the charter realm as well. Tell us a bit about what we've seen from Florida over the past few months when it comes to this pandemic response. I think they're doing some really innovative things.
They are, and we also really benefited from Florida's foresight in funding what we call digital classrooms for about a decade now. We have had a special allocation for districts and charter schools to try to get to that one-to-one ratio with computers to students. So Florida not only did well in their transition to digital and distance learning in the spring, they actually laid the foundation for that for many, many years prior to that in trying to encourage districts to go ahead and buy that technology and build that baseline. But in the spring, I think that Florida did an excellent job switching to distance learning. The Department of Education gave enough flexibility for districts to have the time to make the switch, but they also put enough pressure on everyone and put timelines in place to make sure that we weren't dragging our feet at all, that we were getting right back to learning as quickly as possible. Also, we have, as you know, Florida Virtual School, which was able to, within a matter of weeks, build their capacity to welcome every single public school student onto their platform if they so chose. So over 2 million students capacity was built up in just a matter of weeks. And it was offered to both districts and charter schools to deliver their instruction via the Florida Virtual School platform at that time. So Florida really not only had the infrastructure and the foresight in place to make that switch to innovative learning, as we're calling it, but they also, from a policy standpoint, were able to put enough pressure on the districts to make sure that the teachers were teaching, that students were getting what they needed, that going into the fall here, we're just now putting together our plans that also need to be approved by the state for meeting those special needs and making sure that, one, districts go back with a 5-day-a-week option for students whose families understand that they need to be in school 5 days as well, but that they're also meeting the special needs of those students, and progress monitoring to make sure that any time that was lost or learning that was lost in the spring is caught up quickly.
Right. Well, and in that regard, when we look at nationwide data across school districts in this country, I believe it's the Center for Reinventing Public Education studied how the vast majority of school districts essentially threw in the white towel, as Scott referenced. And again, there's going to be some leeway there from families because they say, look, no one could have prepared for this. But at the same time, there's going to be some new expectations into the fall. You know, what lessons can we draw from some of that data that we're seeing across the country in comparison to Florida? What are some tips that you might have coming from Florida for the rest of the folks that are on this call who are maybe looking for some policy initiatives that they should advance?
That's a great question. And in looking at that study, only 1 in 3 school districts were actually communicating to their teachers that live instruction was expected of them during the pandemic in the spring. And yeah, we shake our heads like, how is that even possible? Obviously, as a teacher, you should be delivering live instruction to your students when you're closed down for months at a time. What the Department of Education did here in Florida, and I would encourage anyone to read the executive order from our Commissioner, Richard Corcoran, used to be Speaker of the House. He pushed through some excellent school choice initiatives when he was leading the state legislature. So he's responsible for a lot of our choice initiatives and a lot of the quality curriculum and standards that we're seeing in our schools right now. As commissioner, he put out an executive order that requires districts to open, like I said, with a 5-day week, and requires that students be delivered live instruction as if they were in class if they are going to choose distance learning. So there is a high bar of expectation put out from the top, from a leadership position here in Florida when it comes to education, that what happened in the spring, which as was mentioned, parents were very forgiving of, passing over a bunch of links and expecting parents to navigate their way through it is not going to be acceptable when it comes to distance learning in the fall. Our teachers are going to be expected to deliver live instruction and for students to have the same experience in a distance learning environment as they would if they were face-to-face.
Right. ERIKA, you touched upon something that I think is near and dear to all of our hearts. It's about the children, right? And especially disadvantaged students are the ones that are likely going to be falling through the cracks of this new and broken system that's getting proposed for reopening and for trying to get education back on track here. Scott, you've been working at this for 30 years, and you were there with a front row seat on the passing of the very first private school voucher program in Milwaukee. And, I'd like to actually get some of your take on the fact that, look, back in April, 40% of families in a poll that we did nationwide had said that they were more likely to consider homeschooling once things open up. And I remember getting a lot of commentary from folks saying that 40%, that's way too high. Your numbers, you're cooking the books or something. And then a couple weeks later, after the lockdowns had dragged on further, Ipsos did a poll that was published in USA Today saying that 60% of families were now considering homeschooling. So Scott, you mentioned microschooling. One of the ways that there's new commentary within the New York Times, for instance, that's saying, well, microschooling is a great idea where families are coming together and creating their own pods or whatever you might want to call them, but it's going to disadvantage lower income families the most. And it's almost as if they're saying, well, what we need to do is provide school choice options. We need to create education savings accounts. What's your take on even Randy Weingarten saying this is a really neat idea, but we just need to make sure it's equitable? What's your take, just being in this movement for so long, hearing these tired arguments against school choice, that now all of a sudden there might be an opportunity that both, as ERIKA, you said, or Scott, you might have said it, suburban parents even who have typically been choosing their own school districts and moving somewhere else, they're finally getting angry at the K-12 system. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I don't think we've ever seen a moment like this where parents have been so engaged in their education, right, of their children. This is what we've always wanted, was parents to be more engaged. When parents are engaged, students do better. The pandemic sort of forced the education chore back into the household. Parents did their best with the resources that were available, but they learned a lot about the schooling their children were getting and what they weren't learning. And they were also, I think, began to look for other options. So we're just seeing it all over the place, including people who have historically been opposed to certain kinds of education are now in favor. I without saying the name of the legislator, there's a legislator who's the chair of the education committee on a major state, who has two kids in high school. One absolutely hated virtual education. It ruined his senior year in high school. It was just terrible. He can't wait to get to college. But the kid who's a junior is like, Dad, can I do this next year? This was awesome. And the student is doing actually better in virtual education than he was doing in person. And so every kid is different, and parents are learning that again. And they're seeing that maybe, in my family, I got 3 kids, they might need 3 different options there. So and people who've been opposed to it in the past are suddenly saying, well, at least for my family, we need another option. So I think there's never been a reevaluation of how we do this in this country like now. And with all the talk we've heard about systemic racism and a reevaluation of that in our society, there's no system that is more dependent, more built around that than the public education system, which says in a country where we assign kids to public schools based upon where they live, and people frequently live in segregated neighborhoods. I mean, that is systemic racism. That is denying opportunities to poor children that other families have.
Right. And Scott, you mentioned what Oklahoma and South Carolina did in terms of utilizing the pot of funds that came from the CARES Act, designated for the governors to have some discretion over. So the CARES Act was $13.5 billion that went to school districts broadly for K through 12 spring remote learning. I think the statistics show that only 2% of that money has been drawn down for spring learning. So I don't know what they're going to do here in the fall. But then $3 billion was allocated to governors. What might be some ideas that you might have for other governors to look towards? Is it just to say, look at South Carolina, look at what Oklahoma, what they've done already, and essentially replicate that? And I think too, as you brought up, parents demanding these changes all of a sudden, I think we're hearing from both Oklahoma and South Carolina sources that they're already oversubscribed. I mean, the amount of people that are weighing in saying, we want these options, we want these new access to these new initiatives. We're already hearing that already. So what might be some ideas, both in terms of politics and in policy, that some of these legislators and folks listening in can take away from this and do to urge their governors?
I think smart politicians will listen to the public. The public is demanding more options for their families, different educational options for their families. And never has it been so dramatic, the request for it. So I think ERIKA's right that, parents are, that politicians are smart now to demand a higher level of virtual education than we saw before. The slapdash thing we saw in the spring is not what's going to work in the fall. So smart governors should be asking for providing training to teachers, demanding a more interaction between the teachers and the students, more resources available for families. That's I think one thing that smart politicians be doing. Secondly, I think they should be trusting parents with the money. There's a lot of parents who are saying, hey, wait, if my school's not open and I'm supposed to be teaching my kids at home, am I doing that out of my own pocket? I already paid taxes. Why can't I have some of that money back? And so we're hearing a lot of parents say, give me a piece of that money. And I'll, if I have to teach my kids at home for 2 months, I should have some of those resources to teach my kids at home. So you see governors doing the special education catch-up grants, the connectivity grants. I think governors should look at other ways in which they can empower parents by giving them more options, giving them control over those resources. One other thing is we should think ahead on this virtual education thing. It's not just to get through this next semester, right? It should be to raise the array of opportunities that are available for kids. Every kid in some rural state, I'll take Iowa, every kid in Iowa should be able to take an AP class in physics. But I'll bet less than 20% of the high schools in Iowa are teaching that right now. But if you build this virtual infrastructure and train the teachers in it, every kid in Iowa who wants to could take AP physics or some language class. And so a lot of rural districts which have limited course options suddenly could have a huge array of course options if we do this virtual education right.
Yeah. ERIKA, you've been dealing with a lot of these issues in particular. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is an excellent opportunity. I've been saying we are ripe now for an academic revolution. You have all these parents that are paying close attention now to what options are available. I was on a school board call, Zoom last night. There's 20,000 students in the district, and there were over 1,000 people on that call paying attention to what the options are going to be. Embarrassingly so, I think, if I was one of those school board members, but this is a ripe opportunity, and I want to speak directly to those legislators that are on the call and make a strong suggestion. When you're trying to do something revolutionary like this and bring new school choice options to your state, to your legislator, you've got to have the 3 Ps. You have to have the good policy, and we know ALEC is very helpful in that, helping craft good policy and share best practices across states. You have to have the politics. And many of you are kind of at the precipice of having the politics in place to get these things passed, especially when parents are demanding it. But you also have to have the PR, right? You have to put things out at the right time. And because so many parents are paying attention right now and wanting these options and looking for what's out there, even if it's not feasible to get a policy through today that parents can access for the fall in just a few weeks, it is the time to announce those policies and say, this is what we're going to be pursuing, so that anytime something happens, if it's a pandemic or in our case, hurricanes or whatever it is, parents should have these options all the time. Parents right now are making decisions in Florida of whether to go to school or not based on whether they require masks or whether they're opening on time or not opening on time. Parents should be able to make those options about a myriad of things that have to do with health, safety, timing, convenience, location. It doesn't matter. What you should be doing as legislators, what we should be doing as policymakers and advocates, is putting those ideas out there at the right time. And because those parents are looking for it now, it's a ripe opportunity.
Right. Well, I think it's important to always talk about, in this realm, when it comes to education, the real world impact of things. And so I'd like to switch the next half of this conversation over to the folks who have seen what this is like firsthand, NYDIA and DENISHA here. And NYDIA too, you've got an incredible story that I'd love to have you tell the audience. But also at the same time, you wrote a piece that got published in a national magazine talking about a crisis that is really facing private schools at the moment, right? Because as this pandemic has drawn on, this is equally affecting every single school in the country, and that includes private schools. And many of these private schools, which you wrote about with your personal experience, they have essentially been almost really facing the brunt of an absolute calamity, where so many of them are helping lower income families, middle income families. They were already operating on pretty slim margins. So you wrote a piece talking about your experience, your school, and also what the federal government should look to do when it comes into this next round of relief. So we'd love to hear your story and love to hear about your piece. Go ahead, NYDIA.
Hi, everyone. So yes, I'll start by introducing myself just a little bit, giving you a little background on my story, as well as my mom's. But both her and I immigrated from Peru back when I was really young, 5 through 7, that year range. And when I first came to the United States, I didn't know any English. And so the most important thing that my mom has always taught me from being very little was that education is the most important thing, and that it's the thing that I have to focus on the most. And so her not knowing the education system in the United States was very difficult for her because she didn't know what school was best for me. And so the first choice that she chose was a school that was very near her job in case of any emergency. Well, as I started getting older and she started getting more knowledgeable about the education system in the United States, she realized that certain schools actually have to send you a notice about the grade that they receive on their school. Well, it turns out that the school that I was attending was a failing public school. And so not so good to hear, but nonetheless, I was always a good student. I'm blessed to say that I had very good teachers who were involved in my education. And I think a part of that too was because my mom was really involved in my education as well, always asking questions. What can I do better? How can I help her? How can she advance a little bit more? And so that helped me a lot. But attending that school all the way to 8th grade and then promoting from there, I wasn't necessarily challenged to my full potential. And so both my mom and I decided that it would be the best choice to move on to a high school that was a private Catholic high school. And so I continued my education attending a private Catholic high school, where it opened so many doors for me. You can definitely see the difference between the education in the public school system that I was in compared to the private school system that I started attending. You have more one-on-one time. The teachers are very involved in education. And like I said, I was very blessed to have that when I was in the public school system, but it was just a different feel once I attended a private school. And so the op-ed that I wrote about, like you said, Tommy, was about private schools closing because parents no longer have the means to send their students or their kids to the private schools that best benefit them. So this whole Zoom call, we've been talking about having school choice. And while private schools are closing down, that doesn't leave so much choice for the parents or for the students to have the best education that they need. So the op-ed really started once I started reading about how Notre Dame, which is the college that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi attended, was planning on closing down. And so I started writing about my experience attending a private school and how it really helped me a lot, challenged me, pushed me to my full potential, opened a lot of doors for me now that I'm 22 years old, and just started talking about how it just was not fair that other students would not get the same opportunity to attend a school that they thought best benefited them. And so that was mainly just what I was talking about in that op-ed.
Yeah, and you wrote about the compounding factors that happen when a private school serving lower income families closes, right? These families are clearly putting their sons or daughters into a school that best meets their needs. So if that school closes, they're going to a school that they didn't want to go to before. And you wrote here, I'll make a direct quote, many have already announced their decision to close permanently. I think we're up to 90 or so that have publicly announced closures across the country. But, and you said, including Institute of Notre Dame, an all-girls Catholic school in Baltimore, once attended by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Absent relief, more and more private schools will close, hurting local economies on the way, and the most vulnerable schools are those in lower income neighborhoods serving lower income families. And I'll skip ahead here to where you say all families, not just those with means, deserve to choose the school that can provide the best education for their children, for all sorts, from that young woman in Baltimore who became Speaker of the House of Representatives to the daughter of immigrants chasing the American dream. Private schools are an essential element in the education of our future leaders. So, that really struck me because you've talked about, this isn't just about school types. Scott and ERIKA have talked about this is about giving all these families more options going forward and not just fixing the somewhat and, actually very broken system of K through 12 education that we had before. I'd love to ask, Denisha to weigh in here too, because Denisha, you were very much at the forefront of many of these reforms as a young girl in Florida. You got the opportunity to attend a private school as well, thanks to a choice scholarship. Thanks to the reforms that Governor Jeb Bush put into place. And then you wrote an op-ed as well, but we'd love to hear your story. And then we'd love to talk about your op-ed and how, some of your ideas, I think, would be really catching fire and building up a movement the more and more that people hear about it. So Denisha, let's turn it over to you to tell your story for the crowd here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining. This is definitely a needed conversation. Probably we spend so much money in K-12 education. And so this is one of the largest systems that's been disrupted because of COVID-19. So definitely a helpful conversation to have in our most vulnerable students. That's why we're talking about school choice, because we are in the business of serving the most vulnerable and making sure that the most vulnerable in our population receive a quality education. And I was one of those students. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, not too far from ERIKA. And I moved around a lot growing up. So that meant I was going to different schools that were, of course, in my neighborhood, and they weren't so great. I ended up failing the third grade twice. In elementary school, failed the third grade twice. And just at an early age began to hate school. I hated reading, I hated math. Anytime I had to step inside the classroom, it was not a good experience for me. Not just academically, I didn't feel like I was cared for. I was going to a place where it seemed like teachers didn't care about me. I would walk into a classroom and teachers would sigh, like literally, why is the student here today? And so it was very difficult. And it wasn't until I began to go to a private school in the sixth grade on a scholarship, because my family definitely could not afford paying tuition, that I began to love to go to school. Teachers cared about me. Walking into a school teachers smiled and welcomed me with joy. And that seems very small, but it made the world of difference inside my life. Teachers would meet with me one-on-one to go over my times tables, to help me to go phonics. And I began to love school. I became the first in my family to graduate from high school and went on to college, got a master's degree. It really changed my life. And we hear these stories all the time of the impact that going to a school has paved for students and for families. Because I received a quality education, now my family is being more engaged in the schooling of other people and other children in my family. I wrote an op-ed, the one Tommy is talking about Black minds and why they matter, especially during this time of COVID-19. Like I said, we're talking about the most vulnerable students. When you think about private schools closing, those schools that are closing are the ones that's serving the most vulnerable kids. And they're not charging skyrocket tuition. They're charging less than the average scholarship that a student receives is not $15,000, which is what the average public school student receives. And so these are schools that are closing. These are students who are being affected, and most of them are Black and brown. When you think about systemic racism in this country and the public schools that are zoned and have been redlined in communities and are not serving students, those are Black and brown students. And in a survey, I know we're talking about a lot here, but in a recent survey, I think we've talked about it before, 40% nationwide said that they would homeschool after COVID-19. Well, 50% of all of the survey recipients, 50% of Black people who were surveyed said that they would homeschool after COVID-19. And that's really remarkable when you think about just the history of the Black community really wanting to have high quality education. And those options right now are not available. And just to go more in depth with the op-ed, it is called Black Minds Matter. So very easy title. I would definitely recommend you guys go back and read it. But you have students who are relegated to very poor academic conditions. There is a recent lawsuit by students in Detroit that won I think it was the first, please correct me if I'm wrong, the first lawsuit that has been filed against the school district on the quality of public education. And they won that lawsuit based on literacy because for decades, students in Detroit had been not graduating knowing with reading levels. They've been graduating not knowing how to read, not knowing how to do simple mathematics. And they sued the school district saying, something has to change. And I think that is gonna definitely be a catalyst for change all across the country to make sure that students are receiving a high quality education, especially when we talk about the public school system. And yeah, I know I get revved up. So Tommy, please bring me in and tell me what next I need to talk about.
No, I would love to give some of the folks listening here, we'll make sure that the links to these op-eds have been published, but I'd love to read part of your op-ed that I think really struck me and has a great turn of phrase for a lot of legislators to think about, and for other folks who are policy makers and influencers. You know, Denisha, you wrote, "Those committed to protecting Black lives cannot simultaneously refuse to nurture Black minds. Our essence and our being deserve life. Our Black minds matter. The discourse for defeating systemic racism must include enacting genuine systemic change. Fighting at the margins won't help." Like you said, I mean, what you're getting at is like, and what Scott referenced earlier, right? There may be all these things that we need to look at when it comes to police reforms, you name it, but we have to talk about K through 12 education if we're going to actually close that chasm between the white peers and Black and brown peers in our public education system. And this paragraph in particular struck me to where you said, "We deserve K through 12 education options beyond the singular one the government assigns. We should no longer tolerate a system that has promoted mediocrity at best and generational devastation at worst." After a 2017 report from Baltimore found that 13 high schools had 0 students proficient in math, Dr. Walter Williams said, "If you were the grand wizard of the KKK and you wanted to sabotage Black excellence in Baltimore, could you find a better means to do so than the public school system?"
Yes.
I mean,
and I'll
wow.
snap for, and it's, when I think about my own life and I think about the life of my family members, I can get really emotional here because they really are the most at risk. And one group of people that we haven't talked about, which the private, and my heart goes out to all of the Catholic schools, like NYDIA wrote about, who are closing and are serving this population, are the students who are on the verge of dropping out of school, just right on the verge of not receiving their high school diploma, and went into a school that was meeting their needs and changed the trajectory of their life. And now, because of COVID-19 and because of funding, that's being threatened. Scott talked about it. One of the things that's happening right now, which is so beautiful, is that people are beginning to rethink education. People are beginning to question all of these different systems, and they're asking critical questions of why have we put up with this for so long? Our students need innovation right now. Why did it take so long for our public schools to bounce back and get online education? Why is my school shutting down when the public school system is not doing anything and they're remaining open? So all of these critical questions are being asked. And I think that is, I worked at the Department of Education with Secretary DeVos for 2 years. And that was the banner of the mantra that we put out all the time, to rethink education, to rethink school. And there are federal relief efforts, the Education Freedom Scholarship Proposal, and right now private school relief funds that are addressing those critical issues. And of course, we have those who are trying to circumvent and trying to throw those options down, but they're definitely so critical for us to talk about and to support. Those funds will be used to give to families, directly to families, to take out the bureaucracy and fund students' education at such a high quality rate and in a desperate time of need.
That's great, Denisha. Well, yeah, hopefully we'll see new legislation this week from federal lawmakers about providing relief to these private schools that are seriously in danger of permanently closing. Hopefully we'll see the Education Freedom Scholarship Initiative that you brought up give families for the long term more options when it comes to their child's education. a lot of states here that I think are going to be eagerly wanting to jump at that, because there's a lot of scholarship organizations, a lot of education nonprofits out there that could benefit from federal tax credited donations to help millions of kids overnight get access to a better education. So I figured we're right on, I think, 40 minutes now. Would love to turn it over to Q&A. So I'll read here one from Logan. He says, I'm with the American Board, an alternative online teacher certification program. Schools already struggle to hire enough teachers to fill the teacher job vacancies, and now the teachers' unions are opposing reopening plans, and many teachers are leaving the profession. What can we do to ensure that schools have enough teachers come the fall semester? And I mean, Scott, I guess I'll turn this over to you. There seems to be this bumper sticker that's now out there from the teachers' unions that says teachers are not essential, right? I mean, they don't,
Right.
grocery stores, alcoholic beverages. I mean, those workers need to get back to work. Teachers, apparently not. I think teachers are essential. I think full-time, in-person options should be available alongside for folks who are elderly, immunocompromised, families that are hesitant should have an online option as well. I mean, options is kind of the theme of this discussion. Scott, what's your take on how, this new teacher conundrum that's come up here over the past couple of weeks?
Right. I mean, we're seeing surveys that suggest as many as 20 to 25% of teachers will not return to the classroom this fall because in some cases, a legitimate reason, they have someone in their house who might be immune compromised and they're nervous about that. But I think there's a lot of other teachers who have just found this switch back and forth from virtual to in-person education to be very difficult. We are going to have more, and there are states that are facing teacher shortages. The answer is, as the questioner had, is we need to rethink the way in which we certify teachers in this country as well. There are lots of people who have extraordinary talents and skills and experiences, but they don't have the education degree in the pedagogy at the university. And so therefore, they're not considered to be a good teacher or eligible to do so. Someone could have spent their life teaching physics or math at a university or taught something at a tech college in a STEM area. We're short of STEM teachers, but those people are often not qualified to be able to then teach in a regular public school. We can't afford any of that stuff. We sort of tied ourselves in knots over the last 30 years to benefit the adults in the system. We need to undo all of that and open it up and free the kids. Let them go to whatever school is best for them. Let's take a look again at the teaching profession, make it entrepreneurial. If you were a really good teacher right now online, if you were able to be really good online with students, boy, you could teach thousands of kids online. And you should be rewarded for, instead of a class of 14, having a class of 1,000 kids where you're teaching AP Physics or Spanish or something. We have to rethink that whole profession.
Right. ERIKA, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, this is another opportunity for reform that is so desperately needed, and that now the public in general is recognizing. Again, talking about what's going on here in Florida, we do have a lawsuit from our teachers union in order for the schools not to open full-time as planned in mid-August. And unfortunately, that puts pressure on a lot of public school teachers not to speak out and say, no, I do want to come back. I do want to teach these kids in person, and I'm not vulnerable. I feel safe in the classroom. But I want to just put forth a scenario that shows you how absurd, and Scott gave some great examples. You could be teaching at the college level and you can't teach 1 year earlier in high school because you're not qualified in many states, and I would say in most states. But as you're talking about these pandemic pods, right, where families are trying to come together to get a teacher to help them tutor the kids or administer online learning, if that teacher is a certified teacher, if that teacher is hired by the school district and they're facilitating that online learning for those students, then they could get public funding for that. But if that teacher's coming from a private school, the students are at home, they're doing the same exact thing, the teacher is doing the same exact thing and facilitating that online learning, they cannot be publicly funded if that teacher is not certified or not qualified by the state, which is ridiculous. These parents should be able to make those choices. Some of the best private schools, the most expensive private schools, have not a single certified teacher in their classrooms, and yet we all know that they are the best teachers in the area. So we really need to rethink teacher certification, and that's another opportunity for choice and flexibility, and as Scott said, the ability for teachers to actually capitalize on their talents and teach more students and have more students impacted by high quality instruction.
Scott, we have another question for you saying here, again, big issue that's actually propped up in the past or maybe even week, but he says, I saw that Milwaukee reversed course today and is allowing private schools to open, but I believe California is still planning to keep them shut down. How do we ensure that private schools are allowed to open? So we've been talking about options, but what do we do if even, governors or attorneys general say, hey, even private schools and other educational options have to be shut down regardless? I know this is going to take a different flavor in each state based upon the orders and the laws, but I would have to imagine a recent Supreme Court ruling might be helpful here too. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, Senator Kelsey asked a great question there. So we need to push back is really the answer at every level. Quite often what we're finding is that it's the local health department, sometimes nudged by the public school system, to say, well, we're not opening, so no other schools should be opening, because they're not really looking for any competition or parents to be able to have additional choices. In Texas, the Attorney General there, Paxton, stepped up and put out a legal opinion last week that said that these local health orders saying that private religious schools could not open was in violation of the brand new decision from the United States Supreme Court in the Espinoza case. So I think in general, what we have to do is we don't want to make the same mistake we did with businesses when the pandemic first occurred. We said some are essential and they'll stay open, and lots of them are not essential and we will close them. When we should have said, if you can operate safely, you can be open for business. And that's the way it should be with schools. And we should encourage schools and provide them with the resources necessary to be open. And if the public school system feels they're not ready to be open, that shouldn't mean that the private schools can't be open, or that charter schools can't be open, or that other options aren't available to parents. So we need to push back against these local health agencies that are trying to prevent schools that have worked all summer long to find ways to teach safely to be open.
ERIKA, it looks like we have a question for you. It says, I would love for Missouri State Board of Ed to hear more about the experience of Florida. How often do state board members interact in ways that can perpetuate success and identify differences that are meaningful? So Florida's in demand. What are ways that state boards of education can benefit from some of these ideas?
Well, I know that the state of Florida is always very generous with our ideas and our experiences, and we'll send people around the country to speak to state boards, to other departments of education. Our Department of Education, especially now with a reform-minded education commissioner, is always willing to do that if you reach out directly to the department, or I can make that connection for you. But also we have some great organizations that put out policy papers in regards to Florida policies, James Madison Institute, ALEC, and others that create these networks, if you will, like this one, where we can share ideas and share experiences. So I would suggest definitely reaching out to either me or directly to the department to get that interaction. But I know, and I'm very proud of Florida in that both our legislature and our Department of Education, of course, led by Governor DeSantis, are very much thought leaders, and we want to set the standard for the country. We want to push the envelope so that other states can say, look at what Florida did, we need to do something similar. And so we always have that mindset, and it's a great place to be when it comes to the school choice movement. Be out front. So you have people like me in Florida that are always pushing and saying it's not enough, but at the same time we realize we are out front and we are setting the bar high for everyone else.
Yeah, and speaking of resources, and giving other legislatures and committees the ability to see the real world impact of choice policies, yes, go to the policy experts too, but feel free to use our amazing students that you just heard from today, NYDIA and DENISHA, as a resource. We actually have more than 500 of these student success stories on our website. You can find them at voicesforchoice.net. They've testified in probably a dozen different state legislatures already. We've been training them to tell their story and to provide that testimony. And even DENISHA's op-ed to talk about the real world impact. I heard from one of our board members that her op-ed turned the tide for someone that for 25 years had been resistant to this idea of school choice. So, I mean, their words and their testimony really are incredibly impactful alongside the policy expertise that Scott and ERIKA bring here. So I think I don't see any other questions. If anyone has any other comments, feel free to weigh in now. Scott or ERIKA, if you have any closing thoughts to the panel here, feel free to weigh in. Otherwise, I'm happy to end early too.
Well, there's a good question from Senator Stevenson, or a point made by Senator Stevenson from Nevada, that,
there we go.
That in that state, they make sure that all of these online programs are available not only for public schools, but for homeschooling and for private schools. It's a public investment in education, and it should be available to everyone. You know, this pandemic didn't just affect certain schools. It didn't just affect certain students. It affected all of them. So all the resources that are coming down from Washington and from states should be available to all parents, should be available to all schools. We want all the students to continue to be connected with a school that's making a difference in their lives. And that's something that people should keep in mind at the state level and at the federal level, where there's been a big pushback when Secretary DeVos has said, well, some of this money has to go help the private schools. I mean, all those kids were affected by this just as much as the kids in public schools.
Yeah, and I'll just also close with a big picture. I know as policymakers, it's very easy for us to get focused on tweaking where we are. That's easier than thinking about completely wiping out the current system and doing something altogether new and better. But I think we can all agree that if we designed an education system based on the resources, the technology, and the innovations that we have today, it would look nothing like what we are dealing with right now. And the pandemic is showing us how really not ready, right, our system is for our problems today, given the technology and innovations that are required to continue on. And so in Florida, we do have programs that are like the Education Savings Account. We just passed the Family Empowerment Scholarship. And that's really the direction that we need to go. If you think about if every single parent had access to an education savings account during this pandemic, and they were able to quickly pivot and say, okay, I was using this education savings account for this private school tuition. That's closed down. Now I need materials for online learning. Now I need materials for at-home curriculum. In the summertime, I need a tutor because they didn't get the live instruction they were looking for. They would have been able to quickly pivot and get their student the things that that student needs individually. So my goal, and the goal of, I know many on this call and many of the organizations involved in school choice, is to get to that point where every single parent has those options. And regardless of their income or their zip code, they also have the resources and the support that they need to make the right choices for their children. And I think we need to keep that end goal in mind in all of the things that we're doing. Of course, keeping our private schools open so that when families have those options, there is a supply available to them. But we know that our private schools will thrive and all boats will be lifted when parents can vote with their feet and they have the funds and the resources to do so. So that would be my end thoughts is, yes, we have some tweaking to do, and many states can do a lot better than they're doing now with some of the innovations that are already in place in places like Florida. But we all have to begin with the end in mind and know that ultimately universal school choice for every single family is the answer.
And it does look like we actually have a late breaking question after ERIKA practically ran for president in that speech there. Do you have any advice for those of us who live in Maryland, where the legislature not only opposes all voucher and charter schools, but included a provision specifically preventing the use of charter voucher, et cetera, when a school has failed over and over? So Scott, you've been at this for 30 years. Any advice there beyond? I have some advice too that might involve a couple people on this call, but.
So obviously the friend there of parents and of school choice in Maryland is Governor Hogan, who has shown before incredible courage in holding out, in vetoing bills in the past to make sure that parents who want additional options for their kids can have them. He's not been willing to let budgets go through unless they've put additional dollars into private school vouchers. So I'm guessing that he's the delegate's best friend there with regards to this issue. And there may be some cases in some states where the actions of legislatures might be reviewed by the courts as discriminatory. And I think there'll be more of that. There'll be more lawsuits being filed here on behalf of parents, trying to give them options, and also on behalf of private schools and charter schools who I think are being discriminated against in this crisis.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to actually turn it over to Denisha and NYDIA to talk about this too, because they've testified in front of hostile legislators, opponents to school choice, and they've even found too where they've melted some pretty cold hearts by sharing their personal testimony. Each student in, whether it's the charter schools or the private schools that these politicians are, let's be clear, I mean, they're trying to evict those kids from the schools of their choice. You know, that's a real person, that's real life. And I know even Denisha, her Black Minds Matter op-ed is starting a bit of a movement. People are wanting merchandise with Black Minds Matter written on it. Denisha, you've even, I think, gone out to Maryland. Why don't you give some of your thoughts on what could be helpful? And NYDIA too, would love to hear some of your closing thoughts, because I think this is an important part of the discussion.
Yeah, the experience that I had in Maryland was so fantastic. Very overwhelming support for school choice. Students themselves marching and waving the banner, literally, of saying, hey, we want more school options. There were thousands of students, mostly whom were not on the scholarship program, the state voucher program, saying that we want our classmates, we want more classmates to have the same opportunities that we have. Just remarkable. And I don't think it's light at all to definitely consider including the stories, including the experiences of parents, of students when marching to your state legislators to ask for more options, because those are the stories and the experiences that sway the hearts to get these bills passed.
I just put a little post in the chat box of Denisha in Maryland. She's, you know, talking in front of a whole bunch of schooling age kids, you know, telling their stories. NYDIA, you know, you too have been in front of, you know, hostile opponents who have, you know, basically attacked your story, right? Of, you know, your story isn't realistic across the country. Tell us some of what you felt, and maybe kind of give that heartfelt message to folks who are feeling that they're in hostile territory. What can they do to create a soft landing zone?
So I think the most important thing that I have to say about this is that in my experience, I know that if I didn't have the help of a tax credit program or all the scholarships that I received or the hardworking parts that my mom got involved with, I would not have been able to attend the school that, like I mentioned before, opened a lot of doors for me, helped me advance in college, you know, even led me to join the military, you know, things such as those things. But I think the most important thing to remember is that even when you're older, you can still fight for those who don't have the same opportunities that you had. And so with me especially, I obviously I still know some of the students who I went to school with back in elementary school, and they are in all types of different positions, but I can only imagine how far they would have gone, even further than they might have been right now, if they had the same opportunity that I had, or they even knew about the opportunities that schools had to offer, or that they had the option of attending a school that best fit them, that made education fun for them, made it interesting, made it so that they wanted to continue their education. So I think there's still a fight to fight, even if we're no longer there anymore. But there's still a lot of kids who need our support and who need the change for a better education.
Tommy, can I say one last thing?
Go for it.
We talked about rethinking education, and Scott talked about it too with rethinking teacher certification, and especially during this time that now we're in summer, and those lines have been blurred between the end of the school year and summer and even after school space. And so I would definitely urge, though that's definitely a space that needs to be rethought. The teachers unions has basically laid claim on the 8 to 3, and the out of school space is definitely up for innovation. And we can now consider blurring the lines between when school starts, when school ends, and rethinking what we do consider school. So just want to leave with that piece.
That's a great point. And Scott, I know last year, I believe at the last ALEC conference, there was a resolution passed talking about support for the Principle of Education Freedom Scholarship. So that's before us. We talked about that today. We talked about teachers unions, politics, and dynamics. We heard from some real world stories here of their lives changing. We've talked about Black Minds Matter and how we need to provide private school relief. We've heard of the great things that Florida's done. If you do need any more information or resources, AFC, we're happy to help. You can reach out to us at federationforchildren.org. Check out all these amazing student stories at voicesforchoice.net. And James, I'll turn it back to you. Appreciate you having us on.
Great, thanks, Tommy. Yeah, thank you all for joining us for this workshop from these engaging experts, and thank you to our speakers and to American Federation for Children for partnering with us. And if you all are interested in attending more workshops for the ALEC annual meeting, I just put a link in the chat box to a workshop on regulatory reform, which is starting here in about 1 minute. Thank you again for joining us for this workshop, and I hope you all have a great day.